Okay, this morning students would have taken paper 2 of the leading Cert Irish, and by and large I think they would be generally happy. A question always dealing with 2 comprehensions. The first one I think would be the easier one, dealing with the foundation of TG Clare and the development over the last 20 years. A comprehension by its very nature means do you understand it, and I don't think the students have found any difficulty whatsoever in comprehending it. In relation to the questions, some questions were very disjointed. I mean, one question would have dealing with 5 parts, so that would be important that they would lay out and make sure that they're showing 5 parts back in their answer. The second comprehension was dealing with Syria, the war in Syria, and the dilemma of refugees and homeless people. This would have been slightly more challenging. Just like yesterday's paper, it shows that the students have to be very au fait with actually what's going on in the current world, and if they have kept up to date with the news, they would have found this a little bit easier. It wasn't difficult, but it would have been a little bit more challenging than the very first one. But again, you know, it's a typical higher level standard. That's one thing. Moving on then to the prose section, this would have shown a surprise. Many students would have anticipated getting the story on Gonora. That would have been widely anticipated because it's the only story that has not yet featured. They didn't get it, they got her Lama book. But the question was very straightforward, dealing with one character, Lizzie Albright. What I would just hope the students would have shown that the question was divided into 3 parts, that she was a woman in charge of her life, her family and her house, and to show that in your answer, life number 1, family number 2 and house number 3. But again, the question was very straightforward, no problem. Moving on to the poetry section, Gavan, again widely anticipated. The question this year that featured on Gavan was possibly the simplest one I have ever seen in relation to this poem. The poem itself is a metaphorical poem and an allegorical poem. Neither areas were touched upon in the exam today, which is strange. I would say that the question that they got on the contrast was comparable to any ordinary level standard. Students would have been delighted with this. In fact, they may have said, is there a trick in it? It seems to be a little bit too simple, but it was grand, and I think they'll be delighted with that. In relation to the Literature of Brescia, there are 2 sections I talk about, the poetry, the Dawn to Brescia and An Trial. The first thing that caught my attention in the poetry would be Grealy. It's one of the minor, more simpler of the 5 poems in this section, and because it's a simple one, there's very little really to ask in it, and the question they did get was again very straightforward, based on contrast. In other words, the 2 gardens and the 2 women, and because it was quite narrow, that would mean that the other areas of that question, for An Trial or Hignal, those questions also would have been narrow. And we saw that in relation to An Trial. Students would have studied their 13 characters, and yet they only got 1. Whereby I would imagine if they had Queen Arthilera on this morning, like they had last year, the question on 3 would have been voluminous, as it was last year. But again, question number 4 was grand, no problem at all. The poetry very straightforward. What I would just feel maybe about An Trial, the students would have not have been able to show all the knowledge that they would have on that play. It was a very narrow question. Padraig McCarthy, the only character asked, showing that he was a man who was false and uncharitable. Again, I would hope the students would see the difference between false number 1, uncharitable number 2. All in all, incomparable to other years, I would say it's possibly one of the easier papers I have seen in recent years. I think students would be delighted with it. It's over, finished.